Rice campus, and for those of you who are tapping in via our webcast, we extend our greetings. This is a special panel discussion on hurricanes in Houston, implications for our future. I'm Jim Pomerantz, a professor at Rice University and director of Scientia, which is the faculty institute that's one of the two co-sponsors of today's panel. In a moment, I'll be introducing Susan Bischoff on my right from the Houston Chronicle, which is co-sponsoring today's event. Let me say back on September 7th, when we first envisioned today's event, as before we look at Houston and on our preparedness for another Katrina, we had no idea that Hurricane Rita would be bearing down on us at this hour. It hardly needs to be said that this makes our panel discussion even more timely than it would be otherwise. So let me not spend our precious time on preliminaries. On behalf of Rice, let me simply welcome you to our campus. Looking backwards, let me say that we're pleased, all of us are pleased with how well this city has carried itself through the Hurricane Katrina catastrophe. We did the right thing in responding to the crisis, and we did it without hesitation, and we did it without second guessing. Houston simply did what needed to be done, and I'm proud to say that we have the spirit in this city, we have the leadership and the wisdom in this city to act decisively and with full intensity when a crisis of this proportion arises. We're here today to look to the future and to examine the projected effects of Katrina, the impact of the people affected, and the influence on the regional, state, and national economy. We're also here to learn how prepared we are if Hurricane Katrina strikes us, which, as all of us know, may well happen in the early hours of Saturday morning. Our partners in sponsoring today's event are the Houston Chronicle, represented by Susan Bischoff, and three groups at Rice University, including the Rice School of Continuing Studies, led by Dean Mary McIntyre. We extend a special welcome to continuing studies students who are with us either in this room or virtually. By the Rice University School of Social Sciences, led by Dean Robert Stein, who's also one of our panelists today, so a double thanks to Bob for doing double duty. And finally, by Scientia, the Rice faculty-based institute that focused on the intersection of science and culture, both of which, it goes without saying, are touched directly by a hurricane. We have a stellar panel with us this afternoon. We've asked each of them to speak briefly and to give us their perspective. We'll follow that with some short Q&A specific to each speaker, and after each panelist has a turn, we'll open the panel to questions from the floor, and for that purpose, we will have microphones circulating through the room. To introduce the panel, we're fortunate to have with us the Associate Editor of the Houston Chronicle, Susan Bischoff. Susan sits on the Houston Chronicle Senior Management Committee and coordinates projects among the Chronicle divisions, as well as managing new products, financial resources, Spanish language publication, recruiting, training, syndicate, and wire services, and community relations for the news division. Susan's a member of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and among other important duties, she served over the last 2 years as a juror for the Pulitzer Prize. So if there are any aspiring writers in the audience, you may need to recommend Susan. Susan.
I'm going to do brief introductions of all of our panelists, and then we'll go to Mayor White first. As Hurricane Rita continues toward Texas, Mayor Bill White brings some relevant experience to our discussion. His work coping with the massive influx of evacuees from Louisiana and Mississippi during Hurricane Katrina drew nationwide praise. That experience provides many lessons that can be applied and are being applied to a similar emergency here in Houston. White was first elected mayor by 63% of the Houston voters. Most expect that margin to be even higher in the next mayoral election. His background includes stints in both business and politics. As an attorney, White was chief executive officer of the Wedge Group, which invests and operates companies in oil and gas services, engineering, construction, and real estate. A one-time chairman of the Texas Democratic Party, he served as Deputy Secretary of Energy of the United States during the Clinton administration. It isn't often that I get to tell Mayor White to Bob Stein. Dr. Robert Stein, Dean of the School of Social Sciences at Rice, will speak on the political implications of Katrina and how a future disaster might affect Houston and its governance. 2 weeks ago, Stein and UH's Richard Murray conducted a phone survey for the Houston Chronicle and KOUH-TV of Harris County residents on whether local governments could handle a major disaster.
Dr. Stein can provide details, but the headline was that residents were split on whether the area is ready for a disaster. Bob is well known to political reporters and those who read their efforts. When a political event or disaster hits, his name is one of the first to be pulled out of a reporter's Rolodex or contacts. He has written extensively on politics at the national, state, and local levels. He holds the Lena Goldman Fox Chair of Political Science at Rice. Phil Bedient. That Houston floods is no big news. Phil Bedient will talk about prospects for flooding in Houston and preventive measures we can take to alleviate them. He's well prepared on that subject. Dr. Bedient is the Herman Brown Professor of Engineering here at Rice. He's the lead author of a textbook on floodplain analysis used in over 70 universities. He's also used his knowledge to develop a real-time flood alert system for the Texas Medical Center. He's developing similar flood alert systems for other areas in Texas, including Austin and Brownsville. Dr. Bedient is collaborating with other universities to develop revolutionary sensing technologies to enable earlier and more accurate forecasts and increase the warning times for severe weather events. Stephen Klineberg. For over 2 decades, Stephen Klineberg has polled residents of Houston and Harris County on their attitudes about public policy and their experiences living in our area. The polling he and his students have tracked the immigration flows that have transformed an Anglo-dominated biracial city into one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse metropolitan areas in the country. A professor of sociology at Rice, Dr. Klineberg, will talk today about the human impact of Katrina, both in the present and future, and the demographics of Katrina's evacuees. This is an extraordinarily busy day for Mayor White, and he is going to be with us for only a portion of the time, so we are going to kick it over to him to begin. Mayor White.
Thank you, Susan. And I guess one lesson we learned about hurricane preparedness is you probably don't want to be in the seminar too long. I've just come from both of our emergency ops centers, and the first responsibility is to the people of this region. I will tell you that that we are right now preparing for one of the larger hurricane systems to be in the Gulf with a 3-day cone that is headed to this region. So I apologize in advance if I have to excuse myself before the full panel discussion. I'd also say that my presence here, the only event that hadn't been canceled the last couple of days, not required by law, is out of respect for the very importance to our entire community of the Chronicle and of Rice University, the editors of the Chronicle, Dean Stein in particular. I wanted to make sure that we continued with some to support some of the community institutions which are so vital to making Houston such an effective city. During the Katrina preparedness, we showed that Houston is capable as no other city in the country for reacting with both compassion and effectiveness, to act quickly and to call on some of the best in the public, private, nonprofit, and for-profit sectors to respond to our fellow citizens in need. Those same lessons carry over to our preparations for this region in where we are within a real risk of significant damage from Hurricane Rita. I think our nation as a whole has learned a lesson about the control and power of natural forces, the potential for the destruction of the levees, which would entail the destruction of the metropolitan heart of a large major urban area, had been long known and understood and apprehended, but it's the nature of the human brain sometimes that the event with catastrophic consequences but small probability is out of mind. I think that's why we wake up each day, sometimes forgetting that each of us has a limited time on this earth. That is what helps create the human optimism and hope and determination to go on, but it can also result in our being surprised for those natural phenomena for which scientists and others have long predicted. Within this region, we know we lived in a coastal plain area that has a very does not have a steep gradient from west to east, creating flooding and drainage problems. This miracle of a city we built in the semi-tropics with natural systems and heavy rainfall that has posed a risk that has been exacerbated by the fact that parts of the city have been built to subside. We've drained some of the parts of the city are up to 10 feet lower than they were just 100 years ago. One of the most areas of greatest growth of the city is 4 feet lower than it was simply 10 years ago. Part of effectiveness that we learned in Katrina is that the emergency response mechanisms, public, private, nonprofit, for-profit, federal, state, and local, can simply be outstripped by the magnitude of the problem and the issue. I think people within the devastated area recognize this too late. Within the Houston area, confronting the problems of accepting evacuees, we very quickly moved to dissolve some of the lines between city and county, public and private, nonprofit and for-profit sectors, to have an organizational chart which had some of the best in the region doing their appropriate jobs. Some of this needs to be improvised based on the ability of the competence of people in an organizational chart. There was one company whose employees were listed that's in the electrical utility business to order furniture to fill apartments, not because that they were the furniture ordering people on the org chart, but simply because those individuals had logistics and supply and technology capabilities that were needed to respond to an unprecedented task. Another large international oil and gas company and their people help match the apartments with the people needing work in various stages, not because they were on the org chart, but because it was incumbent on us to find the best capabilities. And I want to tell you, people as citizens of this region, and from those who learned from the Katrina disaster, that Americans will respond quickly, expeditiously, if called upon in an area of urgent national need to step up to the plate and do what they can. Because of the crisis nature of the situation, the people that were not able to perform or make quick decisions after a while were asked to or did step aside. And people who had the personal competences to make judgments on the spot were elevated in positions of authority, even though their names would not exist on a formal org chart at the time. That is the way that modern, flexible organizations operate, responding to the need with the best available people. So what does this mean for us with hurricane preparation? As we speak, we are responding to the situation in that manner, calling on all resources of the community, breaking down barriers where I came from immediately before coming here, and with y'all's permission, where I'll return to immediately after my presentation. For example, has to do with the transportation logistics in the area. If we don't have enough helicopter intelligence, we're going to get it in the air. And we've learned from Katrina that within this region, if we organize ourselves well, we can have more control on our destiny than if we rely on others that are located outside this region to provide some of that functionality that we have had to supersede. Finally, what I think we've all learned from Katrina, and what I hope we won't need to learn from Rita, but we would if it kept on its current and the course within its current 3-day cone, is to reflect on what Homeland Security really means. The nation, the people of this nation, first and foremost, want to be secure in their homes. They don't want people breaking in their homes because they must feed a drug habit. They want to know if they're having a medical emergency that there will be an EMS vehicle to take them where they can get appropriate treatment. They want their children, their extended family to be secure when they're vulnerable from the everyday things in life that are so important to us. Sure, international crime, also labeled as terrorism, is important. It's part of the international web of security. I think right now a lot of Americans and a lot of people in this region are thinking about the priorities that we place on things like emergency preparedness for those areas that are subject to natural disasters, are thinking about the resources and talent that we spent on our national infrastructure in order to protect us from natural disasters, on the emergency response capabilities that not only are important to us in responding to emergencies, but also have a daily significance to every person in this region and indeed every person in this country when it comes to whether it be putting out a fire or dealing with hazardous materials that may be spilled over into a freeway, whether it be an incident where there's toxins released in the air, or whether it is somebody suffering a stroke or heart attack and needing to get them in a position where they could attain care. Finally, I'll say that it would be everybody here. I'm addressing, if you're citizens of this area, please pay attention to the media, broadcast, print, in every way you can. I will tell you that one of the miracles of America is that we have a varied and competitive media system: radio, television, cable, internet, print. We have multiple outlets, and we're indispensable in dealing with a Katrina type situation. As we speak, one of our best sources of information concerning traffic flows is not only the HPD helicopters that I sent out there when we didn't get good intelligence from some people who are assigned responsibility outside our region, but the major mass media that we have, that is a constant flow of communication for those in this room and those within your networks and those that can be in your network. Learn finally that in a free society with educated individuals, the best emergency response mechanism and the first line of emergency response is neighbor to neighbor. It's individuals not waiting for permission, not being instructed, not being told to look at their neighbor. If everybody waits for a government bus to get out of town, there will be people stranded. If people are now in the evacuation routes and they have a suburban and there's a lot of space and there is a place or a person in need without transportation who could be within their web of contacts, well, I'd say we're calling on you and us as citizens. You will hear about the science of hurricanes, some of the devastation that can occur, and I can't tell you that there's anything about a hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast which is good, or anything that could be prevented by building a man-made structure. I will tell you this, that a major metropolitan area encompassing millions of people, that we will never have an emergency response mechanism big enough to be a substitute for the big heart and consideration and intelligence of people helping people in our region. Thank you very much.
First of all, I greatly appreciate the invite to come join this illustrious group. It is true that I've worked on flooding and flood-related problems in Houston for approximately the past 30 years. But the one that we're facing and the one that we're staring down right now may indeed be the biggest challenge. So with that, let me introduce you to the next slide. This is the 4 p.m. For the very latest information. And please don't necessarily believe the line in the middle. It turns out the line in the middle is oh, thank you. It turns out the line in the middle is essentially about a 15 or 16% possibility. There's also about a 15 or 16% possibility that this storm will go directly into Corpus Christi. and further south and/or, unfortunately, also further north. Any way you look at it, though, this is, I believe it's already become a Category 5 storm, and the hope would be that it will not make a direct hit on our area, but if you look at that graphic, it's a pretty scary-looking sight. Next slide, please. This is a slide that we created last week from the city of New Orleans. And basically, you're looking here, this is web-based information, LiDAR data, overlaid with information on flooding depths. And all of the blue there, everything that you see in blue, are areas that flooded and flooded deeply. The darker the blue, the deeper the flood. And much of New Orleans, much of the area, especially up near Lake Pontchartrain, was actually in the range of 9 to 10 feet below sea level. And I didn't even know this when I went into this study, that much of the area was so far below sea level, protected by all of these levees. The good news for Houston, we do not sit in a situation like this. But that's about the only good news. Next slide. What I want to show you now is there are what are called storm surge models, and then there are what are called floodplains. And I want to introduce you to the storm surge models, and these are models that basically show, and we're only going to show no surge, 15 feet, and 22 feet. And these would basically be a moderate size hurricane direct hit with a lot of storm surge coming up through Galveston Bay and then coming into the area, and then 22 feet. But before I do that, and so all I'm going to do is show you those results. So the next slide will show you a 15-foot storm surge. And by the way, the circle there in the middle is representing the Rice Texas Medical Center area. And then the next slide is the 22-foot storm surge. As you know, from Hurricane Katrina, there was approximately 25 to 30-foot storm surge, the highest ever recorded in the United States from that event. The problem here, though, next slide, is that, and of course these are the types of images that those kind of storm surges can create. They can inundate huge areas at great depth. Next slide. Now we also we're a city of bayous, and this is Bray's Bayou under flood condition. So we live in this area where there are these flood-prone bayous, and it's rare that we actually put together a combination of the storm surge and a 12.5-inch rainfall that might come from a hurricane event. We've spent the last week and a half doing this in order for this presentation. And my colleagues here, Rick Hovinga and Nick Fang, did this work day and night to get it ready. So we owe them a debt of gratitude. But you'll notice in the next slide, this is Bray's. What you're looking at here is a cross-sectional cut profile. These are all the different roads and bridges, for example, for Bray's Bayou. And the concern I have with this slide, and what you're seeing here in light blue is what's called the 100-year floodplain, or the 100-year level, as we go from downstream to upstream, okay? And you see two bridge crossings, one at I-45 and one at 288. And the 288, actually in both cases, the storm surge at 15 and 22 overtop both of these road surfaces. So in other words, I-45 and 288 being the main exit routes from this area, it's critical that we evacuate early, well before this hits. Next slide. Okay, now what I want to do is put together the combination of floodplain and storm surge. Here you're seeing a situation with no storm surge, and you're looking at the 100-year, the new official Tropical Storm Allison Recovery Project, 100-year floodplain that was determined after extensive expenditure of money after Allison and after FEMA, and large amounts of money were spent on getting this data, and it's quite accurate. You'll notice the Bel Air area is bulged out and has a large floodplain compared to Rice and the Medical Center area. And further downstream, the floodplains are smaller. The lowest bayou there is Bray's. The one in the middle is Buffalo, and the one further to the north is White Oak. Those are the only three that we've been able to have time to do. The next slide shows the combination now of the 15-foot and the floodplain, and then finally the next slide shows the 22-foot storm surge, and you can see that it does indeed extend all the way up. Now I told Mr. Havinga that there's no way the audience could realize what they're looking at by a slide at this scale. So I said, please zoom in. And so here's the zoom in. And you're looking at downtown in the yellow dot and the Rice Medical Center area in the other yellow dot. And you're looking at the 22 and the 15-foot comparisons. And I think you'll agree it's major devastation and major inundation on the east side of town and all the way back up into these watersheds as well. So it's not good news. Next slide. And we have all of this information by road crossing detailed elevations. But the real concern I have is the overtopping of I-45 and the overtopping of 288. And for those of you that may not have been here during Allison, 288 had 12 feet of water on top of it, and that was a pretty serious event. The next slide is my biggest fear. This was what happened in 1979 on I-45, and this was during the escape evacuation. And so that's one bit of good news, is that it appears that the evacuation is moving well ahead of schedule. It seems to be, in other words, they've called it early, and I think we're all thankful for that. And the hope is that the storm will not come in and create these types of surge levels. I think, next slide. Yes, that's it, and that's the current picture of where we are as we sit here this afternoon. That's all I've got, Jim. Thank you.
We can pause at this moment for a few minutes of questions and answers directly related to Phil, but then we need to move on to Bob Stein and then Steve Klineberg. We'll have, as I mentioned before, a more extended period of question and answers for the entire panel. Does anyone have a question for Phil Bedient right now?
I know this isn't your purview directly, but is the new Harris County flood control floodplain map that was redone after Allison? There was this big movement to remap.
Yes, what about it?
Is it up to speed now, and what's the...
That's what you're looking at here. So
okay, so...
That's based on the new models, correct.
On the models of current development and concrete and all the rest?
That's as current as we have. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Will McCracken, a retired geology professor, an old guy, and to give you a comparison, when I graduated from UT in 58, I don't have any recollections of these huge floods. I rode my bike all over town, and basically I'm not opposed to growth, but I see a terrible problem. When I came back from California and taught in Illinois 26 years and then retired in 96, I come back and the whole area, I grew up in West U, is covered by concrete. And basically, no one seems to address the problem. It's like trying to get the Indians off the reservation. Basically, it's not rocket science. Rainfall equals infiltration plus runoff plus evaporation, and you don't have much infiltration. It's just concrete. I wish the mayors of Bel Air and West U were here. They tear these houses down, and somehow they get these exemptions and cover most of the lot with concrete, and we don't have the infrastructure, the sewers, and the holding ponds to deal with this problem. And I just wonder, what is your solution to this?
Gosh, thanks for asking such a simple question. I really appreciate that. I wish I had the solution. Obviously, this is something that has been in the making for some decades. And back when you're talking in the 50s, this was a very different city and a very different drainage system than we have now. And I agree with you. There's far too much concrete that's gone in, far too many channels that have gone in without upstream storage, and so on and so forth. The good news is they are moving, for example, on Project Braze, they are moving directly to add large storage areas in the upper part of the watershed and to enlarge the lower part of the bayou. But these are long-term, 10 years away type projects. And so in the interim, we have really no choice but to deal with serious evacuation, deal with flood warning, flood alert until we can get the problem under control. But you raise a very good point.
Okay, we've got a question from Steve Klineberg here, and then another one up there, and then we'll have to move on to Bob Stein.
Steve?
Well, I just want to ask quickly, what do you recommend to your best friends? Should they evacuate? Should they leave here? Is this a fairly safe place despite those horrible blue monsters?
It turns out, when you say the word here, I'm assuming you're meaning the Rice campus. And actually, if I had a choice, I would stay right here on the Rice campus because it's relatively high and dry. It did very well during Allison. There might be some localized street flooding. I had a meeting earlier this morning with the president of Rice, and they're going through major actions to make sure all of the students here are protected and safe and so on and so forth. We're about 5 or 6 feet higher than the Texas Medical Center, and all of our water, unfortunately, drains kind of down to them. And I hope Dr. Bernardi's not in the audience, but this is actually a fairly high place on a relative scale, and I think it would be a good place to hunker down.
Sir, what is the .com or address for that map on the net?
These maps that you're seeing here,
Or are they on the net?
these are brand new maps. The storm surge maps are out there. You can probably get those. You just Google storm surge, and they'll probably come up.
Thank you.
It would be NOAA. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Phil.
You bet. My pleasure.
I was real reluctant to talk about this because it's unfortunate that a tragedy like this brings up politics. But be that as it may, I'll say that two things. One, we have a perfect model for this, and that was Allison. You may not remember, but after Allison, there was an election. In between that, there was another tragedy, and that was, of course, 9/11. True to form of political scientists, like my colleague Rick Wilson, with whom we were interviewing evacuees right after Katrina, we didn't miss an opportunity. We interviewed voters right after Allison, and then just before the election, we had the good fortune of being able to interview voters who were in areas that were inundated by Allison, who had lost property and sadly had had injuries and lives. And very quickly, the politics of this are relatively straightforward. There's a paper that I published called God's Not on the Ballot. She may not be on the ballot, but somebody has to take responsibility. And as a result, what happens with voters is that they very quickly do what we call attribution. In psychology, this is a well-known concept of identifying who is responsible and who can be attributed with responsibility. Voters, and I think you'll see it, I'm glad the mayor's not here because it's better to say these things when he's not around, was a big winner in this. It's quite extraordinary. What the mayor was able to do, and did it as a mayor, I don't presume that he did it with foresight, was to manage well. You can't blame, what voters did in the Allison storm, if you remember, Lee Brown was in a tough race. He ran against a man named Orlando Sanchez, and he won that election, but by a margin about as big as he had won his first election. What happened was voters who suffered in Allison, and sadly there were many, Phil can give you even greater detail on FEMA rebuys and et cetera, but voters who were hurt in FEMA, who had lost property or had damage, and attributed responsibility not to the city but to the county, because that is the flood control agency here, but nonetheless perceived the mayor as a bad manager, voted against him. If you're familiar with where some of the worst flooding occurred from Meyerland going east, it was mostly in African American and Hispanic communities, traditional constituents. So it gives us a very hard task. The mayor lost 15% of his base black and Hispanic vote, largely due to Allison, because these are voters who perceive the mayor as not being a good manager. No, he wasn't responsible for the flood, but he was responsible in the minds of the voters for managing well. Flip it forward some 4 years, and what you see in the poll from the Chronicle was that if voters attributed responsibility to a governor, to a president, and to a mayor, it wasn't there. We had a question in the survey that said, who do you think is responsible for managing this? They were random. They didn't really know. That's because voters have sort of a telephone book knowledge of what the responsibilities of different elected officials are. But when they were asked who did they see as managing this problem the best, it was the mayor. And it was stunning numbers by 30 percentage points. It may have been that he got more press out of this, at least in the case of the county judge. Many don't know who the county judge is. He's been in office 15 years, Robert Eccles, but it's not a high-profile position, and more people know who the county commissioner is than do the county judge. But the matchup was between the governor, the mayor, and the president, and there it was clear the mayor came out, again, enormously high. What he did extremely well was not take credit for doing anything, but always by not taking credit and looking like the city managed well, they were attributing responsibility to the city, and it was simple to see who the key person was. Lastly, and I'll finish this up, what is kind of stunning, was that you would have thought that Katrina would have made us highly sensitive to the possibility of another hurricane. And boy, did it. This poll was done well in advance of any warning about Rita or any other tropical storm. We did the survey about 10 days before even the first tropical storm warnings of Rita. We had thought that people would be slightly overconfident, in large part because there was enormous amount of community pride in what the city had done to help evacuees. If you didn't see it in the paper, what was stunning was voters were almost evenly split about whether or not either the city was prepared to handle an evacuation and respond to a hurricane, and downright dead even on whether or not they were prepared. What's really interesting is the people who live closest to the bay, the Galveston Bay, who are most likely to be vulnerable, were least likely to feel confident about their preparedness. And this is the other flip of the story. The people who are most vulnerable, who live in areas prone to what you call downstream, on the east side, tend to be the lowest socioeconomic status individuals, the least likely to vote, and perceive themselves as being the most vulnerable. Curiously, class doesn't matter here. So if you are in fact wealthy, if you're white, non-minority, and you live in those areas, you also perceive yourself as most vulnerable. The insight in this is a political decision. There'll be a lot of debate about after this passes, and it will pass, and we start rebuilding. And you'll start seeing the political ramifications of this in the debates in the Congress about whether or not we should rebuild in flood-prone areas. It was our speaker, Mr. Hassard, had said right after the disaster in Louisiana, maybe we shouldn't build in flood-prone areas. Don't feel as if he was being geographical, because he said the same thing about the upper Mississippi when they flooded. What will be very interesting is how that debate plays out. One thing this country has always been is a federal system, and the role of the federal government has always been to be the first responder in natural disasters, on the grounds that whether it's a flood in Louisiana or a crop devastation in the Midwest or a terrible snowstorm in Chicago, the government responds. Without trying to be partisan here, which is hard for me, the simple fact of the matter is one of the things that the Republican majority has done since Newt Gingrich is change the debate about the role of the government. And I suspect that the next debate will be, long after Bill's career takes a big jump, will be whether or not the federal government really is the first responder. Listen to what Bill said a few minutes ago. It was a subtle little dig at the president, but it's not so subtle. The shift in the debate has been about whether or not the federal government and Homeland Security is really about the war in Iraq, or whether or not floods, hurricanes, which, whether they're global warming or not, God knows, I don't know. I ride a bicycle, I'm low tech. But the simple fact of the matter is that, I think, is going to be the long-term political legacy. How we debate the role of the federal government. And even some Republicans are now having second thoughts about whether or not you want the federal government to respond to emergencies. Because force majeure, acts of God, are not acts of politician. It is a response that's an act of a politician. But the natural disaster is very much predictable, maybe, but nonetheless outside the realm of politics.
Thank you very much, Tom. Again, we have time for 3 or 4 questions directed just to Bob. I know that Phil's pictures is still on the screen. I'll stay with Bob's side for a while, and then we'll move on to Steve Klineberg. Questions for Bob? We have our microphones.
My memory about after Allison was that FEMA was held in pretty high regard, at least in the Houston area. What I remember is that it seemed to be working well. I remember the big staging area at the old Shamrock parking lot was there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that has not been the case with Katrina. Am I remembering this wrong, or has there been a major failure in FEMA?
No, in fact, I tried to talk quickly. Maybe that's real fast. The answer is that when we interviewed people who had had devastation, lost their property, they gave FEMA high marks. Yeah. Very high marks. I think that's my point. Since Allison and now, we know, of course, the tragedy of 9/11 and a complete dismantling of FEMA, putting into Homeland Security and severe budget cuts. We won't go into Mr. Brown or his successors. The simple fact is that FEMA did not respond well. The president's admitted that. That's an institutional change. And I suspect what you'll start seeing in the aftermath of this is a reorganization or refocusing on Homeland Security, as the word has first. But absolutely right. FEMA got very high scores, and particularly from people who really had devastation, loss of homes and bodily injury.
The government is your enemy and your friend. It's a reminder that it's a whole government.
Can't hear you, Steve.
No, I thought this was...
You have to press the button down.
I was just saying that well-known statement, right? Government is your enemy until you need a friend. And this was a reminder of the role that government needs to play. I think that's exactly right.
Other questions for Bob Stein? Yes, we have some more.
I'd like to know if any of your polling data indicate a willingness of Americans possibly to dismantle or otherwise cut back the tax cuts that President Bush put in place in an effort to pay for, well, you name it, the war in Iraq, Katrina, and the forthcoming Rita.
We didn't ask that. It was done in a national poll, and I'm assuming some of you have already seen this. If not, I'll tell you. The president's numbers are only getting worse on this issue. Yes, the answer is, when asked in a Pew Charitable Trust poll whether or not they wanted to see monies redirected back to Homeland Security, as emphasized, yes. I'll tell you what the other stunning number was. We asked people, would they support a surtax for preparedness? Now, this is not what we call a high tax and spend community. And if you recall, the mayor actually at council, a week after the Katrina evacuees were here, proposed a $15 assessment to anyone who had brought any evacuee in their home, and he had some problem with council. By a margin of 2-to-1, people supported that kind of expenditure in Harris County. So I guess what I'm saying is I think there'll be a slight debate on this, particularly as we go into the rebuilding, and I suspect the Democrats will work very hard on this, but very subtly, to redirect the debate about what the role of the federal government is, period. And that's their best chance. It's the first time the Democrats have actually had a decent issue to discuss and debate, because they've lost that to the Republicans on many. This is a good one.
I get calls all the time, of course. I'm supposed to be an expert on Houston and what is the impact of Katrina? What has these last 3 weeks meant for this city? And of course, the answer is we don't know yet. But there is a sense that this could be a really historical and powerful event. I just wanted to touch on 4 questions that seem to me to be, that at least got raised in my mind in thinking about how we've responded to Katrina and what the long-lasting impact might be for the city. And just share them as questions put to history rather than conclusions at this stage. One of them is, of course, the remarkable evidence of social capital. The mayor mentioned this before, the extraordinary outpouring of volunteering in this community. Houston is thought of as a city with very low levels of social capital. Bob Putnam, the guy who did Bowling Alone, did a major survey of 40 different communities to measure civic engagement. Houston scored the lowest of the 40 communities in terms of how much do you participate in group activities, how much do you trust your fellow person, how much do you think people in your neighborhood would cooperate on a problem. And the conclusion was, well, Houston embodies the central issues that make civic engagement very difficult. It's spread over vast metropolitan areas characterized by urban sprawl, long commutes, growing inequalities, burgeoning ethnic diversity, accelerating influx of new immigrants. No wonder there is low levels of civic engagement and social capital in Houston. Well, what we witnessed in the last 2 weeks, it seems to me, was an extraordinary outpouring of social capital. Over 20,000 people went on their own to volunteer at the Astrodome, more volunteers than there were people, evacuees needing help. The people from the medical community went out to volunteer as doctors, and 300 physicians from Baylor were put on a waiting list. We have more people than we need. A striking kind of thing. So it raises an interesting sort of disconnect between survey research that tries to measure issues such as civic engagement and how a community actually responds when an emergency of this sort occurs. And I think it is clear that Katrina has given the city a new sense of collective capabilities. An army of volunteers we now know can be raised, trained, and put to effective use when the right occasion presents itself. We've seen extraordinary cooperation across political parties and intergovernmental units. Great question for our future is, can this be sustained to address much more critical, long-lasting problems that are central to Houston, its air quality, its parks and libraries, its educational systems? Can we mobilize that same kind of social capital to address these central issues that will shape the Houston future?
And of course, the long neglected issues of poverty are central to this, and that brings me to my second point. The hurricane brought alive to all of us a new awareness of the grinding realities of third world poverty in our midst. The combination of poverty and race that may be more extreme in New Orleans than in other places, but is enormously real and true in Houston, Texas. It's true across the country. We've been watching a growing inequality between rich and poor. The head of the Sloan School of Management at MIT was quoted as saying, "No nation in history, without undergoing either external conflict, either external conquest or internal revolution, has ever experienced such a sharp redistribution of earnings as we have witnessed in America in the last 20 years. This remarkable shift of resources out of the hands of the poor and the middle class into the hands of the rich and the super rich, allowing a series of what are called equalizing institutions, a progressive income tax, a minimum wage that keeps pace with inflation, access to quality education and health care, an earned income tax credit that seeks to ensure that work is rewarded with a living wage. All of those structures have eroded in the last 20 years. The inequalities are increasing, and we have paid very, very little attention to those issues. Another question for Houston's future is, will the experience of Katrina lead us to come to recognize that this is central as an issue that needs to be addressed if we're going to go forward successfully in the 21st century? And then tied into this, of course, is the underlying tension here, because there are large numbers of homeless and poor and hungry in Houston to whom very little attention was being paid, and now suddenly massive outpouring of support for those poor and homeless and hungry. What about us? And you can already begin to see some signs of that tension in the fights that broke out in the Jones High School last week. Why are they paying attention to them and not to us? And I think the mayor understands that whether he can mobilize that support to recognize we got to pay attention to the Houston's poor as we pay attention to the poor of other parts of the country. Third issue, it seemed to me, is an interesting question about the demographic shifts in Houston. I've been fascinated by the fact that Houston's great growth during the 50s and 60s through the oil boom until 1982 was domestic migrants, largely Anglos, pouring into Houston because this is where the jobs were. After 1982, all the growth of this city was immigration from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. And suddenly, as we said, Houston has become one of the most ethnically diverse cities in America. Two absolutely separate waves of immigration. And suddenly, we have a whole new set of domestic migrants coming into Houston. And large numbers of Anglo businessmen who have moved into who were tied into the business of energy anyway, and are now moved into the empty spaces in the downtown office buildings, and they may very well stay here. Large numbers of African Americans. Between 1990 and 2000, the Anglo population of Harris County dropped by 6%. The African American population grew by 18%, just keeping pace with the size of the growth of the population as a whole. The Latino population surged by 74%, the Asian population by 76%. Now we're seeing something of a potential reversal here. On the other hand, the pictures we got of people in the Astrodome and the other shelters were overwhelmingly poor African Americans. Well, it turns out 20,000, they think, Vietnamese have moved here in the last 2 weeks. 20,000 coming from New Orleans and absorbed by the 60,000 Vietnamese who live here now. Large numbers of Latinos have come, but are not going to present themselves to the authorities in the shelters, and in fact have been absorbed as well in various. So we don't know who is here and what's coming. And so the question about what is the demographic transformation of Houston going to be as a consequence of this is, again, one of the open questions as we look forward into the future to see. And then finally, I think interesting is Houston is known to be preoccupied with its image. We don't like the way people see us in the outside world. We have trouble attracting people to come to Houston because they think this is a terrible place. Those of us who live here love it here. Surveys over the years, in our latest survey in 2005, we asked people, how would you rate the Houston area compared to most other metropolitan areas in America? Would you say that the Houston area is a much better place, a somewhat better place, a somewhat worse place, or a much worse place in which to live? 78% said Houston is a better place than other parts of the country. But our Houston image has been negative and difficult and has made it difficult to attract the human capital that will be essential for economic prosperity in Houston in the new knowledge economy. We have just enjoyed an extraordinary period of positive stories about Houston in the national press. And that has also redounded on our whole sense of ourselves as a city that cares. This has not been our usual image of ourselves, nor certainly the image of people outside. A city that cares, a city that is committed to helping people in need, a city that can come together with extraordinary energy and vitality and commit itself to making a difference in the lives of other human beings. And so I think the great question is, will any of this be sustained? Well, already we're now, wait a minute, it's not them anymore, it's us, Rita's arriving, all of this will dissipate. Will we be able to draw on the resources of this city and the communal sense of caring about Houston to do the very tough work that lies ahead, to ensure that we have the fully educated workforce for the 21st century, to revitalize the downtown areas and make the city a much more interesting and beautiful and environmentally healthy place, to build the structures of a truly inclusive, successful, multi-ethnic society that is the hallmark of Houston in the 21st century. These are tremendous challenges that lie ahead, and the energy and the vitality and the sense of self-confidence that this Katrina experience has brought to us in Houston is really, I think, extraordinary and important. And the great question is, will it be sustained, and can we draw on that in effective ways as we go forward in the 21st century? Thank you.
For Steve Klineberg, and then we'll throw it over to questions to all the panelists as we're waiting for hands to go up. Just say, Steve, you've spoken many times over the years about Houston's absorbing people from other parts of the country. You just mentioned this extraordinary figure of 20,000 Vietnamese being absorbed. What do you see are the limits to Houston's capacity to absorb people, physically, to accommodate them within the workforce and schools?
Right, great question. I mean, this is not on again, right? No, it's working. It is working? It's fine. Go. Houston. Don't touch it. Houston does have an extraordinary capacity. We are a city of migrants. We have always been. All of us almost have come from somewhere else and to come here. It's easy to absorb at the beginning. It's one of the things I think you see that's interesting is the combination of costs and benefits that come from a large number of new people coming in. New energy, new businesses get generated, new needs need to be addressed, and so the economy purrs. Suddenly, downtown office space is being taken up and so on. But also enormous costs and difficulties. One of the things that's interesting about Houston is that we are so spread out. We are so lacking in density that we are more capable of absorbing people and not feeling like we've been encroached upon than most of the other cities in the country. So there, I mean, you look at this greater Houston area, the 8-county area, the CMSA of Houston covers a geographical space larger than the state of Massachusetts, 8,300 square miles, right? So there's a lot of space in there for people to be absorbed. The real question is the economy and its capacity to generate the jobs and support systems.
Can we find enough concrete?
And can we avoid, but that's right. Can we, when we put that concrete, make sure that we've got those retention ponds, right?
Well, with all these influx of folks, are there enough jobs for all these folks?
The influx creates jobs and also demands jobs. And Houston had a higher unemployment rate than the country as a whole before this. So the jury is out. I mean, right now it's just addressing immediate needs. People have now moved out of the shelters remarkably rapidly. They are now into places more or less permanent, looking for jobs. Many are finding jobs. Many are waiting to see when they can go back. Who knows what's going to happen with New Orleans over the next period of years? I mean, can you rebuild a city that is sinking, that's already 9 feet below sea level when the seas are rising?
That's going to be a true engineering challenge.
Right.
Yeah, keep in mind that, and I'm sure some of you know this, we're the only city of our size. In fact, we're the only city over 100,000, 250,000, where a majority of the people are renter, not owner-occupied. We're 53% renters, 47 owner-occupied. That's a stunning number in the fourth largest city. That number actually is going down. It used to be close to when Steve and I started. I came to Rice in '79. It was 60-40 renter, owner-occupied. What that means is, 2, we are the cheapest
housing cost city in the country. 3, if we have labor that's caused by people moving in, what you should have is a nice, obvious, nice little engine. I'll give you an example. You go to the website of the Houston Realtors Association, there were 30,000 rental vacancies. What was interesting, and that's dropped dramatically. We're down to like in the single-digit thousands of rental vacancies. But what was stunning was how many of those rental vacancies were single-family detached buildings. They were not what you would think they are. Rental facilities, multi-unit, big apartments. They were single families. And if you actually looked at a map, just like Phil's, except it's not water, it's rental facilities, they run to the southwest, not to the southeast. And I think that's important. And Asian populations, big on the southwest and in the Clear Lake area. What you were, if you look at the HCAT, that's that's a Harris County Assessor's Department. That's where you figure out what your property values were. We are seeing about a 15% transaction rate per month, sale of homes, turnover in properties. What's really interesting, that upticked in 3 weeks by 5 points. So you had a lot of people. The point I'm making is, when Steve tells you we don't know what the evacuees look like, the picture we saw on TV was mostly African American and poor. That probably was 20% of the population that were in the evacuees. The other 80,000 people looked like me, had insurance, had cash, and were buying. And that doesn't even touch on the realtor groups that were buying into commercial. I'm looking at some of the other deans. We all heard this story yesterday. We were trying to buy up building materials, temporary buildings for the university for other activities. We can't get them now. We can't get the temporary buildings, and we can't get the building materials at price. Why? Because the market demand. My sense is, without being disrespectful for a tragedy, it could be a very good thing economically for Houston. And Steve, we were 2.5 points above national average for unemployment in this region. And we tend to be a service economy oriented, right? So building and housing construction is really good for us. We just wiped out a big surplus, and we'll probably, and we might do it again. I don't mean to again. This is a terrible thing to say. But
you're digging the big hole.
I mean, if you're going to lose a lot of property, I mean, disaster relief is a good business, and when your majority leader is from Fort Bend County, down the road here, that's not a bad thing either.
I think we're naturally transitioning into questions from the whole panel.
And this one is kind of for the whole panel, because when you were talking about mobilizing human capital, my first thought was, well, the internet and cell phones, and I think that, you know, getting your building materials and getting people distributed, a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's much easier to find out where to go, what to do, what to find. If you want to help, all you have to do is put something up. And I guess I'd like a general comment. The ability to Google a news article and find out what's actually happening, can you then, not only does it make for a much more effective response and an immediate thing, but you're talking about long-term improvements, and I'm thinking, can you start to rethink how we use our information abilities?
And also to rethink, how do you measure social capital? What does social capital mean in today's world? Many of us have always been after Bob Putnam and his voting alone argument that civic engagement has disappeared in America because he was using measures that worked 40 years ago so he could replicate them now and watch it change. Meanwhile, other things have emerged, and that's a beautiful point. I mean, there's a whole, and obviously something's going on in Houston that generated social capital that Bob Putnam would have been very surprised to see, just given the data that he had.
I want to chime in on that, if I may, briefly. We learned in New Orleans and in Biloxi and in other areas, when newspapers couldn't print, particularly the Times-Picayune, they went online, they were posting PDFs right away. It was very rich. They had reporters and photographers who knew the area, who knew where to go. However, there weren't the products. Some of the biggest complaints we heard were from people who didn't have laptops, who didn't have power, and they were so helpless. When newspapers would be delivered into areas, people would grab them, take them out of people's farms. It's a response that I've certainly never seen in my life as a journalist. So it's a very, very rich economy if you have access to the online information. But in a disaster, when you're cut off from it, it's even more devastating. And when TV stations aren't on the air, everything goes black.
I don't know if you caught something the mayor said about this organization down at the GRB when they first did the Katrina, and hopefully they'll write the history of this. He calls it the virtual organization. But the stories and they're anecdotal at this point, although some students who write are trying to chronicle them. The actors that were most effective tended to be those people who were at the intersection between nonprofits and private corporations. So when he makes that story about trying to find some materials, I think there were cots, a guy from Centerpoint, which is the energy company, one of the reasons they were the most able to move very quickly was they kept better inventory of where they kept their cots, where they kept all their disposable food products, because they would always be sending out people, Centerpoint, to do emergency repairs in Biloxi, in New Orleans, and other places, and all of a sudden they had this network, all done on the internet, of where they kept everything. The same thing with the Walmart people. They had inventories which they keep at different strategic places so they can mobilize them for sales. They knew they had these materials in other places which nobody wanted, but could be mobilized very quickly to move into Houston or into San Antonio. What was interesting, it was all the nonprofits who knew that they had that stuff. And so when you talked, when the stories that were coming out was the private people knew where they were, but they didn't think about it that way. The not-for-profits, nobody ever put all those people in the same room at the same time. It was interesting because there were about 80 people, and working for Bill White is not a pleasant task from what I understand. But when he meant it, he said, and the people didn't perform, they were kicking people out and bringing people in at the same time. It's exactly what the president was not doing, probably, largely because of hierarchies.
These comments also relate to information technology with respect to the types of analyses that we showed earlier. 5-10 years ago, that would have taken months to have completed. All of that information on the city of New Orleans, for example, was available on the web. We were able to look at satellite imagery and actually see flood progression day by day off the satellites, even in and around the Superdome. It was amazing to be able to calibrate that against what we were actually pulling down. And in addition, all this TSARP data and all this new information, it's all at your fingertips, and we're doing analyses now 1/10 to 1/100th the time it took even 5 or 10 years ago.
Tony Wright.
I have a question for Dr. Bedient. Seeing your picture of the flooding of I-45, it became obvious that it's a weakest link deal. You don't have to flood out all of I-45. If you have one little place that's flooded, everything grinds to a halt. So does it strike you as strange that when they constructed I-45, there would be a little dip in an area that was prone to flooding?
Well, what strikes me even more seriously is after I-45 was built and they realized what had happened in '79 from the big flood that overtopped it there at Clear Creek, they put 288 in as the secondary escape route, and they admit that they actually designed it incorrectly and put the level lower than it should have been put. Anyway, to make a long story short, as part of the Braes Bayou reconstruction project, they're going to elevate that bridge. But again, these are enormous undertakings and take years to accomplish. We've got a hurricane, staring down our throats. And if those roads overtop, you're exactly right. It's a disaster beyond belief. The heck with all the inundation, because now you've got thousands of people that are trapped and cannot get out.
And once you're designing and constructing the freeway, it's not a big deal not to have the little dip right there. You got to construct it anyway.
You just, instead of the little dip, you need to have the little dip going
this
way. It's not rocket science. It really isn't.
I have a couple of questions. Steve, one of the things that, when you were talking about social capital, the thing that impressed me so much were the faith-based communities that stepped forward. So when Putnam was looking at Houston, I wonder if he factored in all these faith-based organizations that really stepped forward and are still very active in stepping forward.
Yes, great, Linda, thank you. In fact, he did. There was the one place where Houston came out pretty well, was on faith-based activities. And Putnam makes a distinction, an important one, between bridging social capital and bonding social capital. And churches are much better at bonding social capital than they are at bridging. But you may be right. I think that's exactly, it was through the churches that people reached out far beyond the confines of the church to using the faith-based institutions as bridging capital in ways that again, suggests we need to rethink and look at, well, how does civic engagement and caring about one's community manifest itself in the 21st century?
And I have one more comment or question, I'm not sure. But Bob, you may remember the Paul Krugman article in the New York Times a couple of years ago where he talked about, I'm going to get political, apologize in advance, but he talked about the Republican effort to dismantle government, make it ineffective, and then say to everybody, oh, see, it doesn't work. They don't fund it. They can't perform the things they're supposed to perform, so therefore big government doesn't work. Are we going to be rethinking? Is this an opportunity for us to be rethinking that model that's out there?
I think there'll be a debate about what the appropriate role of government is. I think you'll see Democrats trying to do this and sort of drive a wedge, but the bigger debate I think that's going on in the House right now is where are we going to get the money for all of this? Keep in mind that the federal government is at this point actually bigger than it was in real dollar terms. Yeah. Well, yeah, you're 300. But I mean, if you make permanent tax cuts, you actually are not necessarily raising less money. You're just redistributing it differently. And I think the debate will go on about whether or not the role of the federal government is appropriately on this topic. It'll be interesting to see how long, if this hurricane hits us and hits us hard, and it keeps this story going on for weeks, on top of a bad set of stories coming out of Iraq, I don't see how this administration is going to recover from it. And keep in mind, this is the sad reality, we're not far away from the presidential primary season. So, well, midterm may be the least of because these congressional districts are drawn so tightly, it's unlikely that you're going to see any turnover, right? 97% of incumbents get reelected. There are no challengers to these Republicans, or Democrats for that matter. The debate, I think, will show up in a man like Mr. Frist and McCain, Pataki, Hillary Clinton, but I'm talking the Republican side. Watch how these guys begin to move away from the president and stake out a position, particularly remember that the South is solidly Republican. The Democrats don't have to win the South. They can't. All they got to do is take 2, 3, or 4 states, starting with Louisiana, Arkansas, and Florida. 2 of those 3 states are flood-prone. And I will submit to you that watch what a guy like Haley Barbour does in Mississippi. He's waving the flag for the president, but if Biloxi, Gulfton, if these places don't start coming back, it's going to be hard for a guy like Haley Barbour on top of what? He's got the big Medicare bill, and some Republicans are talking about cutting the prescription drug. The dynamics of this goes on. It's money, it's green, and it means jobs. And in the South, the Republicans have built themselves a solid generational base. That could come unraveled, not by losing the South, but by losing key states. No Democrat can win the South without, the last guy that won it was, of course, Clinton and Jimmy Carter. The other 2 I won't mention, Dukakis and Kerry. So you're looking for a guy from the South. Keep in mind also, I think that any Texan, it's the second largest trough of electoral votes now. So you can't mess with Texas on other reasons than just, polluting.
I think Dick Randy's got a couple up here.
Steve, I'm right with you on 3 of your 4 points. I've read Putnam. I don't get what he was measuring. It seems to me that Houston has been a low-tax, low-service community. That means low government service. There are lots of volunteer service in Houston, and from my observations and talking to people in other cities, we are way out in front of that. Now, maybe it's because our government doesn't do the things that they do in Massachusetts, New York, whatever. I don't know what the hell he was measuring. I mean, tell me how that comes about.
He was measuring, taking a representative random sample of all Harris County residents and asking them, did you volunteer in the last week or in the last month? Or did you make a contribution to charity? And if so, how much? And on that measure of a random sample of all of us, we don't come out so well. On the other hand, what he found in Houston that made sense to me was that there was a much bigger gap in Houston than most other cities, or at least somewhat bigger, but a gap in every city, but especially clear in Houston, between, in terms of socioeconomic status. Poorer Houstonians were much less likely to volunteer, and middle-class Houstonians volunteered the same rate as, or more than middle-class people in other cities across the board. And the reason why whenever you come and say Houston has low social capital doesn't ring true is that you're talking to a middle-class audience that is, what do you mean? I've been to this 3rd meeting I've been to this week, and we're all involved enormously for exactly that reason, because you don't look to government to do this, and we look to. But when you have city growing as rapidly as this one is, with so many non-English speaking immigrants who are part of a sample that comes in, that commutes on average an hour and a half a day to get from work to home, and then asks how often do you go out in the evenings to committees. I think that's what happens. I think that survey research is a very poor instrument to measure social capital and the sort that we're talking about. And it seems to me that the events of the last couple of weeks make that clear, and you're right to raise the question.
Hi.
Hi. Phil, I have a selfish desire to look at your maps more often. Are you going to put them on the internet? Or
yes. Yes, we are. They will be there.
And how will we find them?
That's a very good question. Go to our website, which is fast2, fas2.rice.edu, and it'll be there. FAST2 stands for Flood Alert System 2.
Are you going to keep following this? Will you have charts for tomorrow and the next day, so we'll see where it's all
I don't know about that. Depends on whether we have power.
Stay on campus. Be better
Stay
off.
on campus.
Yes. Thank you, Bob. I think we have another question up on this side, and then someone else down here wants to ask one as well.
Okay, well, I was just noticing that a lot of parallels are being drawn between Katrina and Hurricane Rita, and I was wondering about just one of the most disturbing things that I thought in watching the media on Hurricane Katrina was the way that the government handled the looting, and I was just wondering if you could comment both on evaluating how the media and the government handled the situation with looting in Katrina and the conflicts and the chaos that you foresee with Rita, and if there is that issue in the hurricane that's coming up. And I'm not exactly sure who can respond to that, but just, yeah, I guess the mayor, but he's.
I'll take a crack at it. The New Orleans Police Department has been traditionally underpaid and understaffed and undertrained. There's been a lot of reporting on that, and I know there are many other areas impacted, but the looting was worse in the New Orleans area. The Houston Police Department and the many other law enforcement agencies that are here are better staffed, better trained, and better paid. That does not mean there won't be a problem, but it does mean that there are more people on the streets and that there will be more people on the streets here. In terms of when stores were opened up, and there were varying reports on that at times officials let people in and told them they could take what they needed for their families. I don't have any way of projecting what might happen along those lines here, but I do think that there is more of a base of order and that there is a better infrastructure in the greater Houston area than there was in New Orleans.
There's another major factor, and that is that the Houston area, even if it were to be hit by this hurricane and were to receive large quantities of rainfall, would drain out in a span of 2 or 3, 4 days, but not weeks. In other words, it would drain out fairly quickly.
There's another interesting point here, too, I think, is that the rumors about lawlessness were much, much more rampant than the realities. It was just striking how little there was of breaking of laws and of crime and so on. When everyone thought, all these poor people coming in here, and what are they going to do? And it's a reminder that we're not that stereotypes would remain and exaggerations occur in ways that we all need to be careful of. What's going to happen? I want to ask you, what's going to happen to Galveston in this thing?
It's all a function of where it hits and at what level. The Galveston seawall is at 17 feet. So and the highest point on the Galveston Island is at 22 feet. So
you're talking about surges of how much?
Well, surges of as high as 22, and they could be higher. I mean, that's one more question.
One here and then one over there. 2 here.
Hi, my name is Susanna Cox. I'm an architecture and city planning student. We've all heard about how Houston is a very image-conscious city. One of the main contributing factors to the public relations nightmare on all levels of government in New Orleans was the perception that the disaster was most devastating along class and racial lines. I'm wondering, in terms of the floodplain maps that we have now and demographic studies, do we actually have good numbers about which areas are most at risk combined with the access of individuals living there to reliable transportation? Second, I'm also wondering whether with this potential influx of new people from the Katrina disaster, tens of thousands of people, can we reasonably predict with demographic studies where they've been absorbed in which areas of the community and also their access to transportation? In other words, do we know how many people we may have to move, how fast, and how we're going to do it?
Wow. That's a good question. I can answer two. I don't know which. The first one is, yeah, there are websites. I mean, you can do overlays, and this is the irony, overlays of, we don't have much of rail. Of course, we just have that one rail line, but of the bus lines. And you can do overlays. We did it when we were doing the Allison floods, because one of the problems was that buses actually are very good modes of transportation during floods. They have high. They tend, most of them run off of, their engines are higher up, so they don't catch the water like a car does, and of course they carry lots of people. Turns out that that's the only equitable distribution relative to flood areas. Flood areas tend to be populated by people of lower socioeconomic status. There's no big surprise there. So there's a big literature on toxic and Superfund fights. But they also happen to be people who don't have access to cars, and so Metro is very fair about that. They allocate their bus lines to those people. What we don't know, I think it's a third, or maybe your second question, and Steve hit on this. Rick Wilson, a colleague in political science, is a PI in a project that I'm working on with some people at UT, which is to follow evacuees. And working with some of the mayor's people, we did an evacuee survey at the shelters, and then we did scatter sites. We're now going to try to follow relocations. So the answer to your question is, I don't have the foggiest idea. I just got the data. Rick and I coded up the data this morning of the 600 that we interviewed. And the picture is skewed in many respects by access to the shelters. We also did some interviews, the strange thing of driving down I-10 and going into hotels. Sent the students into 13 hotels on the south and north side of I-10. And that's a very different picture, but not as different as I had thought. We also went to the Hilton, thinking that we'd see lots of Anglos and wealthy types or middle, it may very well be that we just don't know and we'll have to wait, but it'll probably be another 4 to 5 weeks. Chris Holmes is doing some of the relocation. He's our Shell Center Sustainability Center Director, and his specialty is refugees, as in Marinelle boats, Haitian boat people who came over, Vietnamese, and we've been talking to him about doing some survey, but the answer is we don't know. And we don't even know what the number is. I think the numbers are guessing between 75,000 and almost as much as 180,000 people, not in the Houston city, but in the metro area. And that doesn't add up to where those people are, of course, in San Antonio and Galveston, and as far away as El Paso, literally. So, there were 478,000 people in New Orleans proper, city of. Add on another 250,000 who are in the metro area, and they can't all be going back home right now. So I suspect it's a 2 or 3 year project.
And you worry about people who've just been devastated emotionally, and here they are finally feeling there's a safe haven. And look what's coming along.
I think Jim Young has a questioner up at the top.
Working? Yes? Okay. My question's for the mayor. My understanding is that most of the displaced children, displaced being both displaced in that they don't know where their families are and they're here, and displaced just that they're not in New Orleans, right? They've been relocated, have been folded into the already underprivileged schools. That's the majority, and maybe that's wrong, but that was my understanding. So what is the plan for reallocation of resources to deal with the greater need for these schools, in these schools?
Schools that were already underserved. Right. Facing all kinds of problems. There's some hope that we'll get some money, right? That some of this money will come down from...
They're independent school districts, so more than 20 independent school districts just in Harris County. Some 3 elementary schools were open that had been shuttered in HISD. It is, of course, we don't know where the evacuees are, and students are being enrolled everywhere. We clearly had 3 sessions of the legislature and didn't get funding that we desperately need for the schools. So it is a big problem, but I don't know that it does track that they're all in the poor areas, because we have had stories on the very exclusive private schools and the way their enrollment is going up. But we don't have the total numbers, the total picture yet. So,
I mean, the answer is you don't know, but follow the following stories. There'll be 4 bond elections if the hurricane doesn't hit this weekend. No one's called them off. Last week there was a bond election in spring. There were 17 bond elections held in Harris County metropolitan area in the last 8 years, all passed by margins of better than 75%. Spring's the first since Katy ISD, which happened on the day of the Challenger crash, so it has some peculiar idiosyncratic. They went down to defeat, 2-1. What I'm suggesting is the economy is going south for a lot of people. Voters on bond elections vote down school bond elections. Every one of those school districts, whether it's Pasadena Consolidated, Lamar Consolidated, HISD Spring, Cy-Fair, Goose Creek, I could go on, this I know. They're all growing at about a 30% rate. They just got a hit of 100,000, 150,000 households, disproportionately with children. No, that's going to get worse. I don't see how the governor and the legislature can avoid this problem. And I don't think Ms. Spellings, who's a direct, the cabinet secretary of education, we pay $2,600 per child in grants. That's what the state pays. The real cost is around $5,200. So if you do the math, something has to give. This is the downside of this, which is that the state doesn't provide adequate funding, and we have a property tax base for schools. It's only going to get worse.
Susan Wright.
Hold on a second. Here's one piece of data that is out there. Huge numbers from New Orleans Catholic schools have come to Catholic schools here, and they are bursting at the seams. And those are not what I think you were talking about, low-quality schools. And they're very large numbers of those.
Yeah, keep in mind that parochial schools do a great job in the primary and middle schools, but they get squished at the high school level. So if you look at the number of parochial high schools, they're a fraction of what they have in the primary and secondary grade. So this is the kind of thing that's going to, if it stays and the relocation is permanent, it's sort of like Le Pipras, a little big animal in the Balkans, it'll move its way through, and in about 2 years, it's going to pop up again as a big cost item.
Let's go with Susan Wright, and then I'll want to ask Phil about wind damage.
Oh, thanks.
This probably segues right there. I'm wondering, Phil, to what extent does the insurance industry govern, or might it govern, where stuff gets built?
I know the exact answer to that. I mean, I know that they try to create a scenario where you pay in your premiums, and you pay higher premiums if you're in the floodplain. And I know that if now after Allison, if your house flooded to more than 50% of its value, then you're not allowed to rebuild or re-rent, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of those regs came in right after Allison. So I would assume that after Katrina and also after this current hurricane, there will be a staunch move on the part of FEMA to allow or disallow for this.
But beyond that, in terms of underwriting major redevelopment in New Orleans of petrochemical facilities or other businesses, even law offices, what do you foresee?
Insurance.
Yeah.
In New Orleans.
Wait a minute. Yeah. Does not anyone read the catalog of federal domestic assistance? What's the big? No, I'm serious. What is the single largest?
Is that on your website?
That's on my website. You ever hear of flood insurance? Who pays for that? You do.
Yes.
All of us do.
Yes.
The answer to your question is not the insurance company, it's called the builders. Now, what do the builders lobby for? They lobby for federal subsidies. They call them contingent liabilities, right? The biggest federal spending program is not $1, it's the underwriting of risk through loan guarantees, subsidies, and insurance programs. And the Republicans love these contingent liabilities because they're not spending any money until the flood occurs and you have to cash in.
Right.
But that's long after the program's been paid for.
No, I will comment,
it's
though.
The feds.
I will comment that I hope that in the rebuilding of New Orleans, I think there is an enormous opportunity to go in there and correct some major problems. Engineering problems. And I would hope that is, that there's, as opposed to let's rush back in and let's do it as fast and as quickly and as shoddily as possible. I hope there is some long-term planning that goes into where to put some additional levees, where to perhaps divert part of Lake Pontchartrain, where to add some lakes and where to build up some land. There's a lot of possibilities there.
So could you speak to the issue of wind damage? I know you're a water person, but power lines, telephone lines, cables?
Well, again, you're right. I am a water person. However, with respect to the winds, I know that during Alicia, the top winds were about 96 miles an hour. That came through downtown Houston and put 6 inches of glass on the streets. I was here. And those winds of about 100 miles an hour were very concentrated. Winds of about 70 or 80 spread out throughout the area and just about damaged every single sign in all of Harris County. I mean, all the signs were basically torn apart. Here, we're talking about winds that could be much higher than that. And I mean, if you start talking 120, 130 mile an hour winds down along the coast, that's a real serious problem. The other thing I know that after Hurricane Andrew in Florida, the old theory was that as the hurricane moved in and came across land, that the winds would slow down significantly. They found that that was not at all the case in Andrew, and that indeed the winds that came in at 125 maintained about 120 coming across the state.
I thought it did slow down once it got out off the water.
Not the winds, not in Andrew.
How about Rita's potential for spawning tornadoes?
Huge. I mean, if it really comes in as it's projected to be, you can easily spawn dozens and dozens of tornadoes. So it's a real serious problem. I mean, the wind, can be a much greater problem than the flooding problem with a hurricane.
So, Bill.
Last question, Tony Ray.
Do you think that areas like St. Bernard Parish and the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, that the area, the property should be bought out and returned to marshland? What's your opinion on that?
That's a really tough question. There's a lot of cultural history associated with New Orleans. My mom was from the city of New Orleans, for example. I go there often and have visited it. But at the same time, it is a huge problem to try to rebuild many of those structures, especially the wooden structures that have been sitting in 5 feet, 6 feet of water for weeks. I mean, those structures are going to have to be demolished. And so, I mean, it's going to be a huge issue, and that's why I hope there's no way to take New Orleans and raise it above sea level. You can't afford to do it. But you could certainly take portions of it, strengthen levees, raise portions, inundate other portions, and return some of that land back to marsh.
Yeah, so particularly that northeast area that was really low and really flooded, got that triple hit.
Right.
Would that be a candidate?
I think there are some. I think there's some amazing urban reconstruction opportunities here.
Like after Alicia, our area here in Houston, or the greater Houston area of Brownville, that was bought out and returned to marshland.
Which area are you talking about?
I think it's Brownwood. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you mean the old subdivision that went under subsidence?
Same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's one individual subdivision. That's
yeah, right.
Well, thank you all for coming. This has been a great. Illuminating as well as sobering. We promised everyone we'd end on time, and so the hour has come. Many of us, most of us have obligations we need to get to. So let me thank the members of our panel for participating. Let me thank Susan Bischoff and the Houston Chronicle for co-sponsoring. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Be safe, and Godspeed to you all.
No, actually, my mom lived there, but she's Norwegian. Out of Northern.
So much you might be so smart.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. It's current stuff. It's current stuff. It's kind of like your stuff. Your stuff's pretty current. In a different world. Oh, hi.
How are you?
Well, the problem now